you had laws all throughout the country being changed by federal courts that got rid of things that would have led to rejection, right? You had courts changing the laws.
And we've got to correct this. We can't allow another election to happen without having this type of thing cleaned up. And certainly, you can't send out ballots to people who are dead or moved away and have this type of corruption.
Just how is mass mail-in voting fundamentally a less secure system than in-person voting? In this episode, we sit down with former DOJ lawyer Christian Adams, the president and general counsel of the Public Interest Legal Foundation and founder of the Election Law Center. We also talk to Craig Huey, founder of the Election Forum, which seeks to inform and engage Christian voters. This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Jan Jekielek. Craig Huey, great to have you on the show.
Jan, it's great to be with you.
So, Craig, we just had an elections expert on the show, actually, Christian Adams. We were asking him about some various details. We're going to focus with you a little bit more about kind of some of the basic realities that our audiences might not be familiar with. But before I do that, I'm going to ask you kind of the same question I asked him to start the interview, which is quite simply that former President Obama has said the other day that there's no legal basis for the challenges that the Trump team right now has. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that is completely wrong. We have so much evidence of voter fraud as a result of ballot harvesting and the vote by mail ballot and other types of corrupt practices that, we need to be able to make sure this election and future elections are honest and trustworthy. And unless we pursue these challenges in court and prove what is true and what is not, Republicans, Democrats, Independents, Libertarians, everybody needs to have trust in the election. And it's the only way we're going to have it.
So, Craig, from your perspective, where are we at right now in terms of knowing who the next president of the United States is going to be?
We're right now hitting a hard deadline. The investigation into election fraud has to be done quickly. Otherwise, it's an unstoppable event that's about ready to happen. And that would be the election of Joe Biden. But if we're able to prove that there is too much election irregularities in time, we can reverse what's going on right now that the media says Trump has lost.
Well, okay. So tell me a little more. Where do you think things are at in the process? Are you seeing any evidence of this? Where are we at?
There's hundreds and hundreds of documented illegal voting that has taken place. Jan, basically we have an election system that has been broken. It's been broken on purpose. And there's three reasons we have a problem today. Number one is ballot harvesting. Number two, it's the mail-in ballots. And number three, it's kind of the traditional voter fraud. And, I think if we talk about ballot harvesting, some of the issues can become pretty clear.
Okay, well, let's start with ballot harvesting then.
Okay. Many of the viewers may not know exactly what ballot harvesting is. It's legal in 29 states. It's illegal in 18 states. And even in those states where it's illegal, it's still being done. So ballot harvesting, where somebody can collect ballots, nobody knows who they are. There's no audit trail of those ballots. They simply drop them off at a voter box or at the voter center. And some of these ballot harvesters will go door to door and they have data. And what they do is they know who's going to be their voter. They have the data on what their key beliefs are, who's the persuadables, who's the likely voter. They won't talk to somebody who's not. And then they tell them, I'll be glad to help you fill out that ballot from president down to city council. And I'll help you be able to get that in because I'll deliver it to the voter center myself. and people hand these ballots to them. And an example is on the Ring. It's been caught a lady named Lulu was one of the paid volunteers of the Democrats to go door to door with the data. And she has been to this house 6 times, and she can't get a hold of her voter, who's the daughter of the 2 Republicans. And the Republicans answer the door, and she doesn't want to talk to them. She only wants to talk to the daughter. And in fact, if the Republicans had talked to her, she could have thrown away their ballots. There's no integrity in ballot harvesting. It's open to fraud. It's open to Grammy farming, where you can go to a nursing home and pick up 100, 200, 300 ballots. It's open to being able to go to an apartment and get the ballots that have arrived and fill them out and return them. So this ballot harvesting is where, in California, as an example, 2 years ago, 7 Republican congressmen in Republican districts won the election. The day after, they lost the election because of ballot harvesting, because all the ballots arrived in the last couple of days and they were counted last. And that's what we see has happened in this election. So the ballot harvesting is ripe, but it's hard to ripe with the potential of voter fraud, but it's hard to prove, and it takes time to prove it. And that's the problem the Trump team has right now. They have to prove it, and it takes a lot of time. But we've got to get to the bottom of it so that by 2022, we have true and honest elections.
Well, what you're describing, certainly where the ballot harvesting is actually legal in these 29 states, from the sounds of it, it's perfectly legitimate for people to do that. Of course, they can't fill out ballots for people and so forth or tell them how to vote, but they can pick up as many ballots as they like.
Yes, and again, there's no audit trail. And so basically what they have done, the unions, the organizers, they become proficient in how to do this. In California, there's a little bit of organization on the Republican Party, very little anywhere else. California, that legalizes ballot harvesting, what had happened was that the churches, 400 churches that were open despite the lockdown, despite the fact that the government has ordered churches closed, 400 churches that were meeting still had a box where they asked people to bring in the ballot, and the pastor would bring it in. So conservatives, libertarians, Christians, Republicans, they can do ballot harvesting. They're just not trained in it. The unions train people how to do it. The radical left trains people how to do it. And Jan, the fact is, when you have the data of knowing who to go to, you can increase your voter turnout 6 to 10%. That transforms an election. That switches people who would normally win into losers and people who would normally lose into winners. And so it is a powerful thing. But ballot harvesting is not voter fraud, but it leads to voter fraud. And and there's no verification of the vote. And one of the things that has really shaken the election is, again, having a voter guide by the ballot harvesters where they tell them, here's how to vote. They can show them exactly how to vote down to city council. And so it transforms the election when they do that from the top to the bottom.
Well, so basically you're saying, whoever has the better harvesting machine, so to speak, can win.
That's 100% right. You tie advanced data modeling of the voters, give it to the ballot harvesters, and have a mobilization. Sometimes they'll have coffees. Sometimes they'll have meetings. Sometimes they'll go door to door. And here's the thing. Election's no longer about who has the best policies, who's the most honest, who's the best candidate, who's better on TV. It doesn't matter these days. If you can mobilize a base to get out the vote with ballot harvesting, you're the winner.
Okay, so I mean, this sounds like something that's going to be an issue, I suppose, for these runoff elections that are coming up in Georgia, and future elections. But in terms of looking back at this, the integrity of this specific election, what else are you seeing?
Then you have all the states, so many states, they mailed a ballot to everyone. And the problem with that is that these states weren't prepared. The state of Washington has done this for 5 years, and they were prepared for the mail-in ballots. The other states were not, and the whole system just kind of collapsed. And when you do this, there's several areas of fraud that can be proven, and it did happen in this election. First of all, the voter rolls are broken and terrible. Throughout the United States, you have people who are dead, you have people who have moved, you have people who get duplicate ballots. We call it a clean voter roll. It doesn't exist. And these need to be cleaned up before you do any type of mail-in ballot. So what has happened, and many of the viewers probably have had it happen to themselves, people get a ballot for their kid who's gone. They get a ballot from somebody who lived in the apartment or house 2 or 3 years ago and moved. And dead people get the ballots. In California, about 400,000 ballots were people who had died, moved away. And you know what I did when I wrote my book, The Deep State. In the Deep State book, I have a chapter on fraud. And what I did is I had one of the people who assisted me in writing the book contact the voter office and register her dog at an office address. At that time, my office was in California. And for 2 elections, I got the vote by mail ballot for the dog. I could have sent it in. Nobody would have known. And then I moved my office to Tennessee. And you know what happened? Jan, that ballot this year followed me to my new office in Tennessee. That's corruption. That should not happen. And there's no way anybody's going to find that that was a dog because there's no way to tell. And so this is just one of many things that's broken and wrong with the system, and we've got to correct this. We can't allow another election to happen without having this type of thing cleaned up. And certainly, you can't send out ballots to people who are dead or moved away and have this type of corruption. And Jan, there's one more problem with all these people getting the ballots. When people get the ballots, and they're what's called low propensity voters, the people who don't care, people who won't go out to the poll, and they get these ballots, you can define how often they go out and vote. They have very little knowledge about the election. They don't care about the election. They're willing to hand those ballots out to anybody. And so one of the prime target markets are these low propensity voters to get them out. And so in this type of election, to be able to do this massive send the ballot out to everyone, people are getting duplicate ballots. People are getting ballots that have no intention to vote, but they get a knock on the door and they hand them the ballot. And this is wrong, and this is leading to the potential of paying people, giving them bribes, all kinds of things in order to get that ballot. So these things need to be corrected, and they need to be corrected quickly. And this is what is the problem. The Trump team is looking at this, and how do you determine what is fraud and what's not? And it's very time consuming, very hard, and time is against Trump.
So let's talk about that. What are the deadlines?
Well, you have the states have to certify the electoral college and the election, and then the electoral college. So we're talking about coming up a deadline in late November. We're talking about having a deadline in mid-December. And if these things don't happen, and proof that they can be taken to a judge by that time, there's no way it's going to prevail. You know, one of the things that the Supreme Court always does is try to um, keep some continuity and keep things as little controversy as it can. If this goes to the Supreme Court, there's not going to be an overthrowing of the election. There's not going to be a re-election. It could be something that they determined was wrongly done in Pennsylvania, wrongly done in Nevada, wrongly done in Georgia, but it's not going to overturn the court. The court's not going to overturn the election.
So basically, you're saying there's basically a couple of weeks here for this. For what is
correct.
This first deadline that you're talking about? Tell me more explicitly.
So the first deadline is you're going to have the certification of the states of the election. And that's what the Trump team's first hurdle is, to be able to either postpone that certification or to delay that certification because they can prove that things were done illegally. Once the certification happens, then the Electoral College will meet. And when the Electoral College will meet, they are chosen by basically the party that wins in that state. So let's say that in Nevada, Biden wins in Nevada, those Electoral College votes will actually be people that are favorable to Biden. That everybody expects them to vote for Biden no matter what. They're not. The way the founders set this up was brilliant. They can actually vote for Trump. They could vote for somebody else. Back in 1972, I believe it was, John Hospers was a Libertarian Party candidate, and he obviously did not win. Richard Nixon won. But what happened was that one Electoral College out of Virginia, who should have voted for Nixon, actually switched and voted for the Libertarian Party candidate, and he could legally do so. And so Electoral College can switch. But once the Electoral College is decided upon and they vote, then the election basically is over.
You also mentioned earlier that it's not just that there has to be fraud. I think there's some definite examples of fraud. But the question is it occurring at a scale where it warrants delay or, these other scenarios they were describing? From what you're seeing, are you seeing any possibility of that?
I do believe that they can show that there's enough to change the swing state elections, but not enough time to be able to prove it. So as I view this as a long-term process. What can be Trump's legacy? Trump's legacy is certainly in fighting the swamp and the deep state. His legacy is exposing the big media, the biased media, to exposing big tech and the corruption of the big tech. He has a legacy in many things, and his one of his major legacies, I hope, will be to expose the corruption that's going on in democratic cities, and the vote by mail ballot, and the ballot harvesting, and prove that it's too much open to fraud and has to be changed, and transform our elections so that the world can see that they're honest. People can trust that they're honest. Voter fraud, quite frankly, is something that when your God is the government and your religion is to transform that government, you'll do anything you can to cheat for your candidate. And Republicans normally will look at an election. It's the best person running. It's the best policy. But too many people, their goal is to win that election at any cost. And so they will stuff the ballots. They will do things that are illegal. They will do things and try to get away with it and hide it, and they're usually pretty good at hiding it. Those things have to be stopped as much as we can, and recognize people try to do that. And so you have to have the safeguards in place that make sure it cannot happen.
So where else do you see right now are the pressure points?
One of the problems that you have with the mail-in vote is the corruption of the post office itself. And it's on several different ways. Number one, the United States postal system is a Bernie Sanders union. Back in 2016 election, they endorsed Bernie Sanders. And in 2020, they endorsed Bernie Sanders and then switched to Joe Biden after Joe Biden became the candidate. They have actually 2 years ago been charged with fraudulently using employees to do electioneering on postal time. And so a judge prohibited that. But the union, it organizes an army of people to get out the vote. And the problem is when you have a postal union that is political and biased, it affects the mail delivery. And so there is evidence that conservative and Republican mail was tampered with, ballots were tampered with. There is evidence that I see. One of the things I do is I have a advertising agency where we've won 97 awards for the last 20 years, and we've mailed 1 billion pieces of mail, 1 billion pieces of direct mail. So I deal with the post office all the time. You have inefficiencies in the post office where 2 to 3% of all the mail disappears, always disappears. You have the fact that the post office had to mobilize like never before in this last election because so much of the ballots being returned were going to be so late, 7, 14, 16 days late instead of delivery within 1 or 2 days. And they tried to correct it, but you still have several percent of the mail. You have late, you still, even today, have some of the ballots being returned by the post office. So one of the issues has to do with this postal monopoly that's a $68 billion deficit that has become a political organization, and you can't rely upon them when you're doing an election.
Fascinating. To hear this.
Well, I'll give you other examples. If you did a Google search for postal employees or local post offices that ballots and were discovered in trash cans and employee trucks in the last 4 months, there's probably been reported in the press across the United States over 100 of those cases where the postal employees have been charged with a crime, and the post office is an investigation why these ballots were set aside. Well, that's the tip of the iceberg. That's the stuff that's been caught. And so you really have a broken system because it's a monopoly, because the union has made it incredibly inefficient, impossible to fire somebody, and it's a political organization. And so with all this, just think of their self-interest. To survive, the post office needs a bailout. They will get a bailout if Georgia switches 1 or 2 of the candidates switch to Democrat, and you have a House, a Senate, and the president, you're going to have a historic bailout of the post office for their inefficiencies, and it's all on the taxpayers, and it's going to continue the inefficient monopoly. It's got to change, and it won't change with a bailout.
And just to clarify, when you talk about this, the deep state, you're talking about the administrative state of the government. Is that right?
That is correct. So my book on the deep state basically talks about what it is. And I go into the supporters of the deep state, like the big media and the foundations. But the core of it is this. Since the beginning of government, there's been a deep state, not just here in the United States. And that's the government bureaucracy. That's the government employees. And normally, government employees do two things. Number one, they try to protect what they're doing. They don't want anybody to see what they're doing. They want to be able to do it at their own pace, and they don't want to have exposure of what they're doing. And then number two, they want more money and power. And so they want to expand the government bureaucracy. They want to expand what they're doing, even if what they're doing is almost nothing. They want to expand it. That's the normal way a bureaucrat acts. Now, President Obama brought in a third element that was very unusual. He brought in people who were in their 20s. If you went to Washington, D.C. in 2007, you didn't see what you saw in 2000 after the election in 2009. So 2008 election, Obama became president. He brought in 2009 all these bureaucrats that were in their 20s. And they were in their 20s, and they were ideologically driven. Their purpose was to use the bureaucracy to transform culture and politics. So I write about how they were doing that, how when Trump came into office, they became the resistance and tried to resist everything Trump did, not because they're normal bureaucrats, but because they're ideologically driven. Now, before Obama left office, he put in place barriers to firing these bureaucrats. And so Trump did an amazing job of trying to clean house, but only did the tip of the iceberg on that. And that's because of the laws. He even went to the extent where he couldn't fire somebody, some people in the bureaucracy, so he was going to move the bureaucracy to a different state so that the people would resign and not go to the other state. And that had some success. Now, Biden's going to bring in the Bernie Sanders ideologues into the government again, where you're going to have an invisible army of the deep state trying to, again, transform culture and politics through their power, through their influence, through their governmental action. So this is going to be something that will not be good for America. It certainly is going to be horrific for freedom, and it's not going to be good for the economy. So we need to be watching what's going on with the deep state under Biden.
Craig, so I can just tell you that the Epoch Times position on who will be the next president is when these votes are actually certified and so forth. At this point, yes, we don't see that having happened. But you're you're just speaking about it as if it's a fait accompli.
You know what? President Trump is the president of the United States until inauguration date. But he's up against hard deadlines that are built into the Constitution, built into law. And it's unlikely you're going to see any judge suspending that based upon the enormous task of proving fraud. So we can hope for it, we can pray for it, but we want to also be realistic. It's an uphill battle. He could prevail, but whether he prevails or not, this is what he's got to do. He's got to expose the voter fraud so it can be changed and not happen 2 years from now.
So Craig, you're coming at this, really looking at this from a Christian perspective.
Well, yeah, I've been a youth pastor and a singles pastor, but I'm a business owner. And as a business owner, I have an ad agency that has clients worldwide. And so I'm an expert on marketing and advertising, and that's why I'm an expert on what the left is doing, what they did in this election. And they did an incredible, historic job, Biden's group did, that wiped out what the Republican efforts were. The 4 years ago, Trump's team outdid Hillary's team. This time, Biden's team outdid Trump's team, and from a marketing standpoint. And what they did with their digital marketing, their targeted marketing, they actually this time spent close to $30 million in reaching conservative Catholics and evangelical Christians. And why is that important? Because 4 years ago, it was the evangelical Christians and conservative Catholics in the swing states that gave President Trump his margin of victory. The evangelicals voted 81% for Trump. That was historic. And it was because of his policies. It was because of what he said about Israel and religious liberty, what he said about being pro-life, what he even talked about the persecuted church. I was in a meeting of Christian leaders back in New York where 1/3 of them were against Trump, 1/3 of them were for Trump, and 1/3 of them didn't know. And his first thing to him, to all these people who he had to win over, he came out and said, I want to restore the pastor's First Amendment rights so from the pulpit they can speak about truth and the culture and talk about politics and the culture. Everybody looked at everybody absolutely shocked because nobody ever talked about repealing the Johnson Amendment that silenced pastors throughout the United States. And what Trump did caused everybody to stand up and give him a standing ovation, and he won over the crowd at that moment. And so his alliance with the evangelicals has been pretty solid and steady. What the Biden team did, unlike Hillary ignored evangelical Christians. She insulted them, in fact. Biden reached out to him. He had a whole department spending $30 million for direct mail, radio, TV, and lots of digital ads going to Christians. He identified which Christians were likely to be suppressed. In other words, they wouldn't go out and vote. He identified those Christians that could possibly be persuaded to go for Biden. He was able to do an incredible, smart marketing job on the Christian community. And what have the exit polls showed at this point? Instead of getting 81% evangelicals, it looks like Trump has gotten 76% evangelicals. Still huge. But when you lose that margin and you have an election as close as this, that's the difference between winning and losing. And sadly, throughout the United States, because Trump did not do an organized effort towards the evangelicals, most pastors sat this election out. I listened to 3 sermons, church I went to, and 2 online services of well-known pastors. They never even mentioned the election on Sunday. And that happened throughout the United States. In the lockdown states where the churches were closed, where they were going to do church ballot harvesting, there was no ability to communicate and able to do the church ballot harvesting. So much fell apart in this election to the faith community. And so that's one of the reasons I wrote the Christian Voter book, was to be able to mobilize the Christians. We had people sending this book to people in the swing states, pastors and youth leaders. And now there's a concentrated effort in the next few weeks to get as many of the Christian Voter books in the hands of the evangelicals, in the youth pastor, the singles pastor, the women's pastor, the main pastor of these Georgia churches, to try to impact this election, because the Democrats already have their data of who to get to the poll. They're not going to find very many more. And the Republicans hopefully have their data who to get to the poll. And they're not going to get very more. The big group, which are the evangelical Christians, you had less than 50% of them who actually voted in this last election.
Craig Huey, such a pleasure to have you on.
Great, thanks.